Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. High-end LCD gaming monitors haven't been getting as much attention as the latest OLEDs, but they can still provide a great experience. If you're planning on using one for a mixture of productivity and gaming and you don't want to worry about burn-in, or if you want a supremely bright HDR presentation, then a mini LED LCD is probably what you're after. So today I'll be looking at the BenQ Mobiuz EX321UX to see how this flagship LCD contender compares to 4K OLED at a similar price. The EX321UX is a mini LED LCD featuring a 32-inch 4K 144Hz IPS panel enhanced with a 1152 zone full array local dimming backlight. It can push over 1000 nits of brightness with display HDR 1000 certification. It's got a nice high resolution, which is great at this panel size, and it's got plenty of gaming features, including a decent refresh rate, adaptive sync support, and true HDR hardware capabilities. All of this hardware comes at a cost though, with BenQ listing this display at $1,200 US, which is right around the ballpark of the latest 4K QD-OLED and WOLED gaming monitors. This basically puts the two technologies in a head-to-head battle at the top end of the market, and while this price is not as outrageous as what we've seen from HDR-capable LCDs in the past, it certainly faces fierce competition. The design of the EX321UX is pretty decent, with BenQ opting for a two-tone white and black exterior. While most of the outer surfaces are plastic, the style looks great. It's not too gamery, and I especially like the relatively minimal rear panel. I don't think it will blow you away with its build quality, but I think in general this is befitting of a high-end product, and it does enough to stand out from the pack. There are a couple of downsides here though. To house the LCD panel, the display section has ended up quite thick relative to an OLED, and there's a bit of a chin along the bottom edge, though the other bezels are thin. There's also no LED lighting here at all, something that I personally don't care about, but it is a common feature found on higher tier monitors that clearly some people do appreciate. The stand is sturdy and supports height, tilt, and swivel adjustment with a decent amount of maximum height on offer. One of the features BenQ has emphasized on their product page is connectivity, which is largely excellent on this display. We're getting one DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, 3 HDMI 2.1 48 gigabits per second ports, and a USB-C supporting DP alt mode and 65 watts of power delivery. There's also an additional USB hub consisting of another Type-C data-only upstream port, a Type-C downstream port, and 3 Type-A ports. 2 of these ports are on the rear of the monitor and 2 are on the bottom edge for easier access. BenQ have integrated a KVM switch as well, which is great to see. There's a few additional bits here. I really like how easily accessible all of these ports are on the rear, as they all point straight out the back, no need to fumble around. The HDMI 3 port supports eARC, which is very useful for hooking up a soundbar. There's obviously great console compatibility. BenQ even advertises this alongside a PS5 on their website, which runs it up to 4K 120Hz on this monitor. But they're also a bit misleading about DisplayPort support. They claim this is a DisplayPort 2.1 monitor, but it only features 32 gigabits per second HBR3 class bandwidth. It doesn't use any of the newer UHBR bandwidth classes introduced with DisplayPort 2, and so it still needs to use DSC over DisplayPort. Advertising what is essentially a DP 1.4 class port as DP 2.1 is technically allowed under the DisplayPort spec, but it's pretty misleading to customers, especially those who are specifically on the lookout for real DP 2.1 to avoid DSC. The OSD is controlled through a directional toggle along the bottom edge of the display, or through the included remote control, which is a handy addition. It includes a good, though not amazing, set of features. There's some gaming specific settings such as a crosshair, FPS counter, and shadow boosting modes, plenty of different color presets, but nothing especially unique for a premium product. As a 4K LCD monitor, text quality is excellent and a non-issue, exceeding the quality you get with today's OLED panels. There's also no risk of permanent burn-in, making it well suited to productivity tasks, and this continues LCD's position as the go-to display for anyone using their monitor for a mix of gaming and work. The display coating is a standard matte anti-glare finish, which we've seen across most LCDs for the past decade. It's similar to what you get with today's 4K WOLED monitors too, like the LG 32GS95UE and Asus PG32 UCDP, in that it does a good job of minimizing reflections in bright environments. The trade-off is coating grain, which is light to moderate here, and general light diffusion, which can reduce the pop to the image. I don't think this is a bad coding, and most 4K monitors have some sort of trade-off, as even glossy QD-OLED panels have difficulties in brighter environments, but naturally, this will disappoint those that wanted a glossy, HDR-capable 4K LCD. As far as I'm aware, that panel type just doesn't exist in the gaming market right now. Moving into response time performance, BenQ offers 4 options controlled through the AMA setting. At all brightness levels, this display uses a high-frequency PWM signal to control the backlight at around 4 kHz, despite the display being advertised as flicker-free. AMA level 0 shows native panel performance around 9 milliseconds, which isn't especially fast, so I suspect most gamers won't use that mode. AMA 1 increases performance to a 6.7 millisecond average response with no overshoot, although cumulative deviation is still a little weak at just 655. AMA 2 appears to be the optimal setting for 144Hz gaming, producing a 5.6 millisecond average and slightly better cumulative deviation than before, still without much visible overshoot. The highest setting pushes things too far and produces obvious inverse ghosting, so that setting is unusable. Unfortunately for variable refresh rate gamers, BenQ has not implemented variable overdrive, which probably should be used on a high-end display. This means that while AMA 2 is the best 144Hz mode, when you use this setting at lower refresh rates, overshoot becomes more noticeable. At around 60Hz, the inverse ghosting rate exceeds 37%, which means visible artifacts. AMA 1 doesn't push overdrive as hard, so when you get to lower refresh rates, this mode has no visible overshoot, and that makes the setting the superior option for variable refresh rate gamers. It's hard to say whether the EX321UX has a single overdrive mode experience as a result. AMA 1 looks pretty similar to AMA 2 at the highest refresh rate, with only a small performance advantage for AMA 2, but AMA 1 is better across the refresh range and could be considered good enough for gaming without needing to change settings. Ideally, this monitor would be tuned a bit better and offer a mixture of the 2 AMA settings through variable overdrive. At its highest refresh rate, this monitor is very competitive with other 4K LCDs. It offers a very similar experience to SDR-only 32-inch models like the LG 32GR93U and Lenovo Y32P30, while outperforming some of the older variants, in particular the slow PG32UQX. However, it lags behind the Samsung Neo G7 with its VA panel, and performance really doesn't get close to an OLED panel, giving products like the PG32 UCDM and 32GS95UE a huge clarity advantage at the same refresh rate. Across the refresh rate range, the EX321UX offers an average experience, nothing much to get excited about here. Performance remains similar to the 32GR93U and most other 4K LCD models, but far behind OLED panels. It probably could have moved a few positions up the chart with better tuning, but current IPS LCD technology appears to be the main limiting factor. What was most disappointing was the EX321UX's cumulative deviation performance. While response times aren't necessarily bad by themselves, cumulative deviation was lackluster and fell behind some of the better LCD models like the 32GR93U. There's not much overshoot, so the main contributor is slow response times. With that said, this BenQ model is 26% better than the PG32UQX, a previous mini LED monitor we looked at, and is visibly clearer while gaming. For fixed refresh rate gaming, this monitor is acceptable at 120 and 60Hz, but didn't offer anything especially groundbreaking. For the most part, I'd describe this monitor as on the slower side of average for an LCD, though it's usable and it has few annoying artifacts. Aside from response times, the other main consideration is the refresh rate itself. Many 32-inch IPS LCDs are still limited in this area, the BenQ topping out at just 144Hz. Meanwhile, OLEDs have sailed past, offering up to 240Hz at the same 4K resolution. This increases the motion performance pain for LCDs, as not only are OLEDs clearer at the same refresh rate, they also offer a higher refresh. 240Hz OLEDs are roughly equivalent to 360Hz LCDs, and at 144Hz they're around the mark of a 220Hz LCD, so the latest OLEDs run as fast as possible, deliver more than double the clarity of this LCD. To minimize this gap as best as possible, modern mini LED LCDs should be 240Hz, especially at this price tier. The lower refresh rate also has an impact on input lag. While the EX321UX has a great SDR processing delay, it doesn't have as strong overall latency as the refresh rate is just 144Hz versus 240Hz for the top monitors. This is further weakened by its response time performance relative to OLEDs. On top of this, like most locally dimmed LCDs, input latency in the HDR mode is reduced as it has to run a backlight zone algorithm. This adds about 2 frames of latency, pushing out the processing delay to nearly 15 milliseconds. OLEDs don't need to run such algorithms, so their HDR input lag is substantially lower, although to be clear here, these LCDs don't have terrible input lag or anything like that. They are very usable in their HDR mode, just not as fast or responsive as OLEDs. Power consumption is one of the strengths to LCDs, and the EX321UX is an especially efficient mini LED model. OLEDs consume 2 to 3 times more power to display full white, and even for lower APL content, power consumption is still typically higher for OLEDs than LCDs. It's good to see this BenQ model is significantly more efficient than some of the previous 32-inch mini LED LCDs we've checked out, such as the Samsung Neo G7 and Asus PG32UX. Another strength to this BenQ monitor is its extremely wide color gamut, covering 99.6% of DCI-P3 over 99% of Adobe RGB, and in total 87.5% of Rec 2020. This is among the best results I've tested from a gaming monitor, exceeding both QD-OLED and WOLED, and providing ample coverage for both work and HDR content. Out of the box, the EX321UX doesn't have the best calibration. It enables local dimming by default, which isn't ideal for uniform productivity apps at times due to blooming, and this also seems to impact accuracy a bit. As a result, the gamma is too high, and this leads to mediocre delta E's. My unit was also slightly blue tinted in terms of white balance. Outside of grayscale, the monitor does not use an sRGB emulation mode by default, so SDR content is quite oversaturated. Skin tones especially can look too red in this configuration, a byproduct of Rec 709 or sRGB content being expanded up to fill the enormous color gamut of this monitor. High standards have been set in the flagship 4K monitor market, and the EX321UX doesn't quite reach them in factory calibration. Most of the OLEDs I've tested have been significantly better tuned out of the box for grayscale, although for color checker it's more of a typical result. Luckily, BenQ include an sRGB mode that is much better calibrated for SDR usage, although unfortunately it still locks several settings. In this configuration, grayscale performance is significantly better, with much better gamma accuracy and improved white balance. The gamut clamping is very effective as well, leading to strong delta E's in saturation and color checker. However, there is one significant flaw with this sRGB mode, and that is its contrast ratio. For some reason, when enabling this mode, contrast drops to just 660 to 1, which is terrible. So while the EX321UX is one of the better monitors I've tested in terms of its sRGB mode calibration, finishing near the top of our charts, I think some people will be put off using this config due to its low contrast output, and fair enough, contrast is important. The good news is that you can fix the sRGB mode's contrast by disabling the Uniformity setting, which restores native panel contrast to above 1000 to 1. The bad news is this impacts accuracy and gamma. In this configuration, performance is still decent, but it's a shame we have to sacrifice a few delta E points to bring the contrast ratio back up to an acceptable level. Maximum SDR brightness is extremely high, pushing up to 750 nits full screen white, which is so bright it's uncomfortable to use. It does offer a lot of flexibility though. For example, if you have an outdoor gaming setup for some reason, this destroys OLEDs in brightness. Minimum brightness is also decent at 37 nits, so there's a large range of brightness on offer. The native contrast ratio of this panel is good for an IPS LCD at 1400 to 1, but isn't especially good overall. A low native contrast ratio means that local dimming needs to do some heavy lifting to make HDR scenes look good, with less reliance needed for VA LCDs that have native contrast above 4000 to 1. For SDR content without local dimming, like if you're using desktop apps, black levels aren't amazing. Viewing angles are decent, though not as good as OLED competitors. There's a large sweet spot for viewing though, and you don't have to put up with either a narrower sweet spot or a curved screen, like would be necessary if this was a VA LCD. Uniformity though is lackluster. While the central part of the screen is nice and consistent, the edges have a noticeable vignette, especially when the contrast destroying uniformity setting is turned off. This makes edge-to-edge uniformity worse than the best LCDs, and especially OLEDs, which generally have great uniformity. Mini LED LCD with full array local dimming is a good technology for HDR, as it has the capacity to enhance contrast and brightness above what a typical SDR LCD is capable of. It's not as immediately well suited for HDR as OLED, as zoned LCDs require more extensive tuning, but if the hardware capabilities and firmware tuning come together nicely, these mini LED panels can produce outstanding HDR. The level of contrast and control that a mini LED panel can achieve is tightly linked to its native contrast ratio and amount of dimming zones. In the case of the BenQ EX321UX, we're looking at a 1152 zone backlight, meaning each zone is responsible for about 7,000 pixels, a decent number of zones. But the native contrast of the panel is just 1400 to 1, meaning each of these zones needs to do more work, as in adjusting its backlight level to achieve high contrast. Typically for an IPS LCD, we need to see more backlight zones to compensate for its low native contrast relative to a VA LCD with a higher native contrast. The combination of both elements, contrast and zones, is somewhere around the average to good mark here. In most situations, the EX321UX is capable of great control, utilizing its backlight zones to show very bright highlights and dark shadows on screen at the same time. The zones are small enough that relatively tight control is available around most elements, so blooming isn't often a concern. It's rare to see large sections of the screen destroyed by an elevated backlight, like you get with edge-lit dimmed panels, and across most content the screen looks great and is capable of a high contrast ratio. However, there are the usual pain points for zoned LCD relative to OLED. The very smallest elements can cause blooming or haloing artifacts where the backlight zone is simply too large to tightly dim around the object. Zoned LCDs can also struggle with hard, high contrast edges like text or the edges of applications. So scenes with star fields or subtitles are prone to blooming, and this is more noticeable than on a VA panel with a similar zone count but higher native contrast ratio. In some scenarios, particularly in games, there are also times where you can notice each zone activating and deactivating in motion, again usually in darker scenes with small bright highlights. On the worst monitors, this can look like backlight flicker, but it's not too bad or distracting on the EX321UX. None of these backlight zone issues are present on an OLED, which has per pixel control and therefore much tighter dimming ability. The benefit to getting an LCD though is brightness. Compared to an OLED, most mini LED LCDs are significantly brighter, especially for high APL, brighter scenes. Panel dimming and automatic brightness limiters are much less aggressive on an LCD, so the difference between full screen brightness and small window brightness is smaller. If you want the punch of extreme brightness and prefer this aspect of HDR instead of, say, perfect contrast control, then LCDs are easily the better choice. What's disappointing about the EX321UX's HDR experience though isn't so much the HDR hardware capabilities, but its tuning. The available HDR configurations are not great, and BenQ have made some bizarre choices around how to control the backlight. The best and most accurate mode is the display HDR mode. This setting gives you the full brightness the panel is capable of and the best EOTF tracking. However, as you can see, EOTF tracking is far from perfect. There's a dip in the mid to lower part of the curve indicating that common midtones are too dark. There's also a surprisingly high black floor in this mode for a mini LED monitor, as well as some weird jumps in the EOTF curve. Thankfully, color accuracy is strong with a huge color gamut to work with. All of the other modes are much less accurate and some of them are terrible. Even after messing around with various configurations and settings for hours, the best I could achieve was sort of this in the fantasy HDR mode. The curve is quite wonky, contrast is weird, although the black floor is a lot lower. I have no idea why BenQ allows a deeper black floor in the other HDR modes, but raises the black floor in the display HDR mode. It seems like an unnecessary limitation. In dark real-world content, this monitor also seems to struggle with its black floor and shadow detail, and this applies to all settings. It seems BenQ are preventing the monitor from hitting the very deepest blacks unless nearly the entire screen is black, possibly to minimize blooming, and this limits the available contrast in dark scenes. I also noticed that BenQ have implemented some sort of letterbox detection, so when viewing 21:9 aspect ratio movies, for example, instead of the black bars at the top and bottom of the screen being pure black, with the backlight zone switching off in that area, they are actually switched on and not showing full black. Some scenes trip this detection up and drop the black bars to near full black though, which honestly looks much better. So again, maybe this is some sort of system to prevent blooming along the edges of 21:9 content. With other mini LED LCDs that I've tested, particularly VAs like the Samsung Neo G7 and more recently the AOC Q27G3XMN, displaying brilliant shadow detail and rich blacks has been possible, but the BenQ EX321UX seems to be more conservative with how it handles dark content. Brightness in synthetic tests is excellent, hitting over 1400 nits full screen, which absolutely destroys OLED competitors. 10% window brightness also reaches 1400 nits, over 50% brighter than the best OLEDs I've tested. 2% window brightness is a bit lower at just 1076 nits, but this is still bright and very competitive with OLED panels. This creates a huge advantage for the EX321UX in brightness versus window size at basically all points except the very smallest windows. In real scene brightness, this monitor is similarly dominant, topping the chart for average brightness and providing the best results in 7 out of 8 tests. There is a small amount of dimming in mid-APL content, but this is related to the poor EOTF tracking I was talking about earlier for midtones in the display HDR mode. There is clearly no bright scene dimming, as evidenced by its ability to reach nearly 1600 nits in high APL scene content. OLEDs just can't keep up here, especially in mid and high APL scenes. In contrast tests, we can see the impact from the black floor issues in the display HDR mode. In best case scenarios with bright and dark objects far apart, this configuration tops out at just 49,000 to 1, still okay for HDR content but far away from the best results. Even the PG32UQX, which has a similar IPS LCD setup with 1152 backlight zones, trounces this configuration. The Fantasy HDR mode with tweaked settings is better, but less accurate. With that said, both modes far exceed the contrast available from edge-lit panels, which normally top out around 15,000 to 1 in this test. For worst case contrast with a bright and dark element right next to each other, the EX321UX performs pretty well, delivering around 3x its native contrast. This is similar to the PG32UQX and twice as good as some other IPS LCDs with lower zone counts, like the 576 zone XV275KP3, which validates that more zones are better. However, even 1152 zones with IPS can't outperform 336 zones with VA, like you get with the Q27G3XMN, let alone the Neo G7. Triple the zone count isn't sufficient to match triple the native contrast, showing the continuing importance of native panel performance. The gap between the aforementioned monitors is smaller in checkerboard contrast, but mid-table overall. Then for HDR accuracy, the issues with grayscale EOTF hurt the BenQ here, especially relative to premium, well-tuned OLED competitors. The EX321UX is much more competitive in color match accuracy, but absolutely needs a firmware update to address grayscale. Lastly, we have HDR color volume, and this is another area where the EX321UX performs really well. The combination of high brightness and a wide color gamut leads to a chart-leading ICT-CP color volume of 24 MDC, which is 14% higher than the best QD OLED monitors. In the Essentials checklist, BenQ do a reasonably good job of advertising the monitor, including accurate HDR claims. However, response time numbers are misleading, as is claiming the display has DisplayPort 2.1 when it still has DisplayPort 1.4 class bandwidth. Not something that I'm a fan of, as some buyers are searching for genuine DP 2.1 UHBR class displays. As for the feature support matrix, the key wins for BenQ here are brightness and contrast, as well as feature support. We're getting USB-C with power delivery, a KVM switch, graceful SDR HDR switching, no obvious flickering, and so on. The color gamut is also very wide. However, there are misses for areas like cumulative deviation, HDR processing delay, HDR EOTF tracking, and Dolby Vision. I also spotted some unusual choices around backlight zone tuning that I think requires further firmware tweaks, and on AMD GPUs, local dimming seems broken in some situations when FreeSync Premium Pro is activated, yet another monitor that is made worse from supporting FreeSync Premium Pro HDR. The high-end monitor market is about the best of the best, and throughout 2024, we've seen plenty of new 4K OLED options vying for the crown of best overall gaming monitor, whether that's WOLED or QD OLED. I think that a good quality mini LED LCD gaming monitor could be a genuine third option. After all, LCDs have some strong advantages, including very high brightness, no risk of permanent burn-in, and great text quality. Depending on your preferences, there's absolutely a reason to pick an LCD. Just not the BenQ Mobiuz EX321UX. For a high-end monitor commanding an eye-watering $1,200 US price tag, this zoned backlight LCD just isn't competitive enough with other options to justify its price. The high-end market in particular has taken a big step forward in 2024, and this display feels like it was designed for a time where we didn't have excellent OLED monitors at around $1,000 US. There are a number of issues with the EX321UX that are exacerbated by BenQ targeting a premium price point. The biggest one is motion performance. Maxing out at just 144Hz with fairly average response time tuning is not sufficient to compete with OLEDs that offer 4K 240Hz at a lower price. At a minimum, this should have been a 240Hz monitor because that's the standard that has been set. Alternatively, 144Hz with average response times is fine for a 4K monitor, just not at $1,200 US. The simple reality is that an equivalent, similarly priced OLED for gaming is much clearer, smoother, and features lower input lag. We've also seen the high-end market significantly step up its game when it comes to calibration in both the SDR and HDR modes. Now, there are some issues with OLEDs for HDR. Brightness, and in particular panel dimming, in some scenes does come to mind, but generally there's been a decent effort to provide a well-calibrated experience. The EX321UX isn't at that level due to its mediocre HDR tuning and weirdness with zone control in some scenarios, as well as an sRGB mode that for the best accuracy hurts the contrast ratio. Now, there are some positives here. HDR brightness is fantastic, blowing OLEDs out of the water pretty much across the board, but especially in brighter content. This BenQ isn't the best for shadow detail, but man, does it deliver a punch when high brightness is required. It's also a much better candidate for productivity use cases than OLED, as it won't burn in from static content over time. Those that need a dual-use monitor for work and gaming should still be looking towards LCDs, as they're a more versatile product. I also like the range of features that includes plenty of ports, eARC, a KVM switch, included remote, and quite a nice design. There's a lot of stuff around the edges that point towards the EX321UX being a high-end monitor. It's just let down by its panel performance and tuning. With a few firmware updates, it may get into a better position, but there's zero guarantee of that, and you shouldn't make any purchasing decisions based on future updates. For all I know, this is how the monitor will perform forever. The package that the EX321UX offers would be okay if the monitor is cheaper and not in direct competition with 32-inch 4K OLEDs, which usually start around $1,000 US. For most gamers, I would strongly recommend an OLED over this monitor, and for those after an LCD specifically to avoid burn-in, I think this is a bad deal, and I would feel rolled given the gulf in capabilities. Yes, this is a brighter and better monitor for static content, but an OLED is better at pretty much everything else. It's also far too expensive compared to similar non-HDR 32-inch 4K gaming monitors. Products like the great LG 32GR93U have regularly been available for around $520 US in the last few months, so the EX321UX is adding full array local dimming to that package for a ridiculous $700 US premium. Even the Samsung Odyssey Neo G7, which does have zone dimming and true HDR, is priced between $600 and $800 these days. And that's really where the EX321UX needs to sit in terms of pricing. $700 or around that mark is fair pricing for an okay HDR-capable IPS LCD. Maybe you'll be watching this review in a few months and BenQ has dropped the price to below that of OLEDs, in which case, awesome news, it's time to consider this display. Until that happens, it's impossible to recommend. And that's it for this review of the BenQ EX321UX. I'm still quite positive about mini LED LCD technology, so this isn't a case where I've just looked at a mini LED product and I've gone, okay, it's not as good as OLED, so I'm not going to recommend that. I do think that with the proper tuning, the proper calibration for these sorts of products, that a mini LED LCD can be as good as an OLED. So hopefully we see that with some future products, especially because we can get that nice high brightness experience, lack of burn-in. That would be a great experience. But unfortunately, yeah, this just isn't a monitor that we can recommend at the moment. But anyway, if you do appreciate our testing here at Monitors Unboxed, then please do consider supporting the channel. We have our Patreon and Float Plan accounts. The links to those are in the description below, where you'll get access to the ICC calibration profiles that we create during our reviews. We also have our Discord community, which is a great place to chat about monitors, lots of knowledgeable people in there, good for getting recommendations. I'm in there sometimes as well. So yeah, if you want that sort of thing, then the Discord community, part of our Patreon and Floatplane accounts, is a great way to get that sort of thing. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.